An eventful but quite a difficult Friday to get your head around as we began the Mexican Grand Prix weekend, complicated by Pirelli wanting to do a lot of 2025 tyre testing in FP2 and by some substantial red flag periods as well. In the second session, which was the beginning of the Pirelli tyre test, the big Pirelli tyre test on the test tyres, George Russell, having done one quick lap and then had a radio message to say that Lewis has just done another quick lap out of that first set of tyres, was going very, very hard through the quick S's, lost control of the Merc and damaged the car sufficiently badly for it not to be usable for the rest of the session. And George himself's a little bit shaken up. Very big impact, no damage in terms of injury, but George a little bit shaken but walking back to the garage at the end of the session. It looks like he just lost it. The car looked to be bouncing quite a lot of cars bouncing through the high-speed S's there. It looks quite dodgy, a lot of sparks from under the car as he began to lose it. But also on the marshal's notes, just before he went off, there was mention of the track surface losing grip just there. It didn't say precisely why, whether it was oil, whether it was something else, but the track in that sector had suddenly lost grip as well just before George went off. So yeah, not a good day for Mercedes in that sense, although George was very, very quick and fastest of all in FP1. We'll get onto that in a minute. So before we get into the detail of who drove what, because a lot of the rookies were out in FP1 as well, let's have a look at the overall results of FP2. The test tyres that Pirelli brought were definitely quicker, or seemed to be quicker. Maybe the track was faster as well, but definitely quicker than the soft tyre had been in the one-lap runs in FP1. Stick with me here. A lot of toing and froing between the two sessions. So let's have a look at the results of FP2. Carlos Sainz, who was also very quick, P2 in FP1, quickest of all in FP2. Really, really good job. 17.699, as you can see there. Oscar Piastri, not very happy with the car, with the McLaren in the first session in the morning, but they improved the car a lot in the afternoon, or the car was much better on the 2025 Pirellis, one or the other. And McLaren, almost uniquely amongst all the teams now, a lot of upgrades in terms of cooling for Mexico, for the brakes and for the engine. But in terms of upgrades, McLaren continuing to work on the performance of their car, even though it is super quick already. They've got a new floor here in Mexico, which they describe as heavily revised with geometry changes in all areas for increased aero load across all conditions. Wow. All the other teams should be so lucky to be able to be as confident as McLaren about the performance of the new floor. Anyway, in the second session, Oscar Piastri a lot happy with the car on P2, and Lando Norris, who didn't drive in FP1, his place was taken by Pato O'Ward, recovering pretty well from the lack of seat time to be fourth quickest. Yuki Tsunoda very quick in the morning and the afternoon, amazing on the soft tyre and on the hard tyre with the fuel run and on the test tyre in the afternoon for VCARB, very good VCARB Honda. And Kevin Magnussen and Nico Hülkenberg, the usual suspects there, Haas Ferrari, also very quick. But I should say here that Lando did that time on the medium tyre right at the end because he hadn't been out in the first session along with some other drivers, Charles Leclerc, Lewis Hamilton, good examples, Fernando Alonso, another. He was allowed to run the medium tyre just at the end and he went super quick on that. Fernando Alonso also went quicker on that, but Lewis Hamilton didn't find time in it. That time, 18.279, represents his best on the soft 2025 test tyre, which of course isn't being raced this weekend. And nor did Charles Leclerc go any quicker. He didn't even try to go quicker on a set of mediums. He just drove them out onto the grid to do some practice starts. So Charles Leclerc getting pretty quickly up to speed, despite light damage on his Ferrari. We'll get onto that in a minute when Oliver Behrman was driving it this morning and was hit by Alex Albon's Williams Mercedes. Valtteri Bottas has looked pretty good throughout the day, there or thereabouts in the VCARB. Wonder if they'll be able to keep it up, if he'll be able to keep it up for Stake Sauber as the weekend progresses. We've often seen this team looking quite good on Fridays and then fading away when it comes to qualifying. Sergio Perez, kind of there or thereabouts. Lots of support in the crowd, of course. Had a blemish-free day, you can say that, unlike Max Verstappen, who began to lose power after about 4 laps into his fuel run in the morning. And then this afternoon, in the test run, he just couldn't get the engine. They couldn't get it charging. The engine wasn't working, and so they decided to take the engine out of the back of the car, and he didn't do any laps at all. And Alex Albon, you see at the bottom there, is they're never able to repair the Williams in time. Let's have a look at the speed trap now for FP2. I've set them out slightly differently, and you'll be able to compare that with FP1 a bit later on into the video. You can see that Lewis Hamilton Mercedes really quick in a straight line. George was quick in a straight line this morning as well in the Mercedes. 3.56 for Lewis. All the top speeds were up on the Pirelli test session in the afternoon, up on the morning speed traps. The wind had died down a little bit. Also, the track was getting quicker, and the tyres are quicker as well, presumably. Well, certainly quicker over the lap. Whether they're quicker in a straight line is another matter, but they are FP2. All the times were up. Lewis 3.56, Carlos Sainz 3.54, Charles Leclerc 3.53 in the other Ferrari. Where are Red Bull and McLaren? McLaren very slow, 3.42, 3.41, but very good over the lap. So they're never going to be quick in Sector 1 because so much of Sector 1 is dominated by the straight in Mexico. But look at that. 3.42, 3.41. I guess they're going to be maybe taking wing out of the car for tomorrow if they can do that. Equally, they'll be hoping for DRS in the race, I guess, but because they will get blown away in a straight line, certainly off the line as well. If they are that slow, that's over 10 kilometers an hour slower than the Ferraris in a straight line. So they're going to have to do something about that. But in terms of the overall lap, it's really working well for them in terms of downforce. On a day when we saw Alex Albon lose the back end, we saw Liam Lawson almost have a massive moment, losing the back end as well. And of course, George Russell having that shunt that I just mentioned. So they're right at the back of the bottom of the list in terms of speed trap times. Red Bull about in the middle. You can see 3.47 there, Sergio Perez, Max Verstappen. Yeah, they'd probably want to be a little bit quicker than that. And they were a little bit quicker than that relative to the opposition. They were about where Ferrari were in the morning, but looks like they put a bit of downforce on the car for the afternoon. So it was a bit of a complicated Friday in Mexico for a number of reasons. One, the teams are obliged to run rookies, and they tend to do it in Mexico. A lot of rookies having a run there. A bit odd, the choices. I mean, we had the Ferrari driver, Robert Schwartzman, in a Sauber Ferrari, and we had Oliver Behrmann, who's racing for Haas Ferrari next year, in Charles Leclerc's Ferrari. And so it goes on. Lando Norris sat out FP1, which again I thought was rather a strange call. You know, here is the guy most likely to challenge Max Verstappen for the Drivers' World Championship. You'd imagine McLaren would want to give him as much seat time as possible, particularly as it turned out the McLaren wasn't very good in FP1, didn't feel very good to Oscar Piastri, and so they could have benefited, of course, from having Lando in the car there. So again, you know, if you're going to put anybody to one side, you would imagine it would be Oscar for FP1. No doubt they did it because they're doing it in turns, the drivers take it in turns, and to some extent I suppose it's moot because in the second session, which is extended by 30 minutes now, traditionally, so that Pirelli can do a proper test in terms of performance runs and long runs on their 2025 tyres. The drivers who didn't get to drive in FP1, the race drivers who didn't get to drive in FP1, were given an additional 30 minutes to run the race tyres this weekend, whereas the drivers who did perform in FP1 were not allowed to go near the compounds for this weekend. So it's all a bit complicated, quite difficult to read too much into the results. But let's start by having a look at the overall results of FP1. You can see that George Russell was very quick everywhere in a straight line and in all the sectors, looking really good in the Mercedes. I mean, where were they last weekend? 17.998, the only driver under 18 in FP1. Carlos Sainz also looked very, very good in the Ferrari, I thought. Yuki Tsunoda, yeah, you know, again, this probably means shouldn't read too much into it, but can't take it away from him, P3 in the V-Carb Honda. And Max Verstappen, 18.8, didn't get a great lap in on the soft tyres. There's just one lap on the soft tyres doing these times. Max then was the first driver to start doing full tank runs, fuel runs anyway, long runs, but stopped prematurely because he felt there was something wrong with the power unit. So we'll see what happens there. Watch this space. Nico Hülkenberg, Oscar Piastri, who said the McLaren felt pretty terrible throughout the session. Esteban Ocon looking quite good. Again, rather strange that he should be in that car and they didn't give some more seat time to Jack Doohan, who was just in the garage. He's the full race driver for Alpine next year, but anyway, they're doing what they're doing. Sergio Perez looked quite good for a while and was not too bad on full tanks either, but the session was notable for quite a big shunt to Alex Albon, who you see down the back of the list there. He didn't get out on soft tyres, who was on a very quick lap. He was P3 at the time and came across Oliver Behrmann, who was on the side of the track. You could argue he should have been on the inside rather than the outside, but it is the S's there, so you can't go weaving all over the place if you are going slowly. And and Albon would have had sight of him as he was coming out of turn 6 anyway, going into the S's. It looks to me like on the last left before the last right, if you get what I mean. We're talking high-speed S's here. Alex just asked a little bit too much of the car. The back end got away from him, and then because Behrman was then in his eye line and obviously making the corner a little bit shorter, he gave it a little bit more steering, a little bit too aggressively, and lost the back end, and then overcorrected, and then in the overcorrect hit Behrman's left front on the Ferrari, and then that shot the Williams off into quite a big high-speed impact into the Tech Pro barriers, which stopped practice for quite a long time. With the red flags, obviously. So the Charles Leclerc Ferrari was damaged. We wouldn't have impressed Charles too much. The stewards in the end, I think, came to the conclusion that it was a driving error from Alex Albon, because neither driver got any sort of penalty or reprimand. And as I say, when he got out of the car, Albon kind of, the gestures suggested that he thought Behrman was in the way. As I say, I'm not sure where else Behrman could have been. And it was quite interesting, I thought, when Robert Schwartzman came around. He was the first on the scene he was driving the Sauber Ferrari, as I say. And there's obviously no love lost between him and Behrman, because he immediately said, Behrman's caused a big shunt or something like that. And it's just like, whoa, wait and see what happened there before you make that sort of comment. Anyway, speaking of the rookies, let's have a look at how they performed. Obviously, we're not going to have Oliver Behrman in there because he didn't get a lap in on the soft tyres. But that's in the order of their performance, really. The difference between the rookie and the regular driver in the other car. Felipe Drugovich was in Fernando Alonso's Aston Martin, 0.21 slower than Lance Stroll. I suppose you've got to take into account who the other driver is, because it's one thing to have Lance Stroll to beat. It's another thing to have, say, Oscar Piastri to beat. So, a pretty good job by Felipe Drugovich. I was a little bit surprised by his corner entries. Looked a little bit wider than I remember him. It's so long since I've seen him in a car, and he's been in a car, really, I guess. It just shows that, if you don't get seat time, that starts to go away from you a little bit. Anyway, it was a good lap. Full credit to him. Really rate Drugovich. But I still can't see what future he's going to have at Aston Martin. He needs to get out of that deal if he's going to become a race driver. OWA is not Owasa, the Japanese driver. It's Pato Award, the IndyCar driver under contract to McLaren. And again, I was a little bit surprised by that. I'm not surprised in a way. I mean, I'm sure Zach's a big fan. And they ran Alex Palou, I think, at this test last year. But I would have thought, given Toyota's interest again in Formula One and their association now with Haas Ferrari, I would have thought it would have been a good moment to have given Ryo Hirakawa, the Japanese driver they have under contract, a run, if only just to sort of reminding Toyota that McLaren has still got to deal with them as well, because further down the road they might well want to have a Toyota engine deal. Anyway, they didn't. They put Pato Award in the car. And again, not quite sure where that fits in terms of his future in Formula One, or any future he might have in Formula One. But he looked pretty good. He drove very well, I thought. 0.3 slower than Oscar Piastri, the named Oscar Piastri, who wasn't very happy with the car. I don't think he was out there doing a really quick lap, flat-out lap, in a car that he didn't feel particularly comfortable with. He's been around long enough in Formula One to be doing that sort of thing. But for Pato Award to be only 0.3 away on soft tyres, only get one lap, bit of pressure on them, pretty good performance, actually. And then Robert Schwartzman, 0.8 slower than Valtteri Bottas in the Sauber Ferrari, and the slowest of the lot, actually. And that's partly reflects the speed of George Russell. And I guess partly reflects also the shunt he had at Monza when they put him out on soft tyres right at the beginning of FP1 and he crashed at the Parabolica. This time, all the rookies went out a little bit later than the regular drivers. And Antonelli, 1.2 seconds off the pace, off the George Russell pace, in what, on that morning, in Mexico, was quite a quick car. So, a bit of an odd performance. Lewis Hamilton in the garage watching all that, of course. Let's have a look at the speed trap, because that's quite significant in Mexico. Well, it's very significant in Mexico because it's all about how the teams generate efficient downforce in very thin air when there's a lot of drag on the car. So Mercedes at the moment seem to be doing a very good job. But let's have a look. I've listed them in terms of the speeds now, and you can see the sort of bulk of the field is around the 343, 342 mark. But Nico Hülkenberg and Kevin Magnussen both very quick in the Haas Ferraris. No real surprise there. They haven't been super quick in a straight line this year, so quite a good job. That augurs quite well for them in the race. George right up there, 348 in the Mercedes, and Antonelli 342. So maybe they were running a little bit more wing on Antonelli as well. But equally, look where Yuki Tsunoda is with 339 top speed, and he was FP3. So it's not necessarily a given that if you are slow in a straight line in Mexico, you're going to be slow over the lap, because look where Sonoda is. So 346, Kevin Magnussen, Oscar Piastri 346, Max Verstappen 345. So at the moment, Red Bull and McLaren very, very evenly matched, with Ferrari there as well, 344. So three of the main protagonists about the same, with the Mercedes a little bit quicker than those three. And then you can see bunched together some of the other speeds as well. And as I say, Max Verstappen was the first to put fuel in the car and get out and do some long runs, but it was a short run for Max because of that power unit problem. But these were the key long runs of FP1, and we'll talk about FP2 in a second. But George Russell did a good run. I mean, very quick on soft tyres and pretty good on the long run as well. But if you look at the list there, the only two in the 22s comfortably were Max and Carlos Sainz. So Carlos Sainz in the Ferrari looking very good. Not quite sure, obviously, how much fuel he had in compared with Mercedes, but on the assumption that they had more or less the same, maybe a bit less, a shorter run, obviously. Nonetheless, that's a very quick, good run from Carlos Sainz. George Russell's fastest lap, 23.0, did do 2:23s, whereas Carlos is down in the 22s, a second a lap quicker. Max Verstappen in the mid to high 22s. Oscar Piastri, 23.2, 23.0, about where George Russell is. And Sergio Perez in that sort of territory, again, slower than Max, but not too bad on this occasion. So that was the busy and rather complicated Friday in the build-up to the Mexican Grand Prix. No sprint this weekend, so tomorrow it's qualifying for the Grand Prix at the Circuito Hermanos Rodriguez, named after Pedro and Ricardo, but the fans are there, of course, to support Sergio Perez this weekend. Big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, and to Track Ninja, and of course to you, the viewer, for watching. See you tomorrow. Well, at the risk of stating the obvious, how's that for a driver who's about to get sacked by his team? Carlos Sainz, absolutely superb for Scuderia Ferrari around the Autódromo Hermanos Rodriguez in Mexico. A packed Autódromo, you got to say. Most of the crowd probably there to support their countryman, Sergio Checo Perez, but he didn't make it out of Q1. So who else to support? What about the Spaniard in the red Ferrari? Just brilliant. Carlos Sainz made the point as he crossed the line. They said, great lap, Carlos, great lap. He said, no, two. And he was absolutely right, because his first run was a 16.0. Then he did a 15.9. Nothing nicer than getting under some sort of barrier like that. The only driver to do it, 15.9. But as he said, that 16.0 would have been good enough for the pole as well. So 2 laps, good enough for the pole. 2 laps quicker than his teammate, Charles Leclerc. Very important point, of course. And I think if you look at the results, if you look at Carlos Sainz ahead of Charles Leclerc, if you look at Lando Norris without Oscar Piastri to pressure him, but nonetheless only P3 in what is still a very, very good McLaren. I'm not decrying his lap in any way, but a little bit of a surprise that Lando wasn't there, bearing in mind Oscar Piastri was so quick in FP3 as well. We'll get on to that in a minute. He was quickest in FP3. But Lando only third, and then George Russell ahead of Lewis Hamilton. You have to wonder whether or not it does have an effect, this business of the rookies getting into the race drivers' cars in FP1 in Mexico, because Charles Leclerc could look back at qualifying and say, well, I didn't do that FP1 and I needed that seat time. It's a really, really difficult lap. As it was, Charles did lose a lap in qualifying to track limits and had to perform under pressure. Carlos Sainz, no issues like that whatsoever. And George Russell always had the edge over Lewis Hamilton, even though George, of course, had that big shunt in FP2 yesterday, and the mechanics had to work through the curfew. They're allowed to do that only twice a year, but no problem for the mechanics. Did a very good job rebuilding the car. And again, George slightly quicker than Lewis, and Lewis making a mistake right at the end of his qualifying lap in the final sector, in one of the twiddly bits. Very unlike Lewis to do that sort of thing. So I just make the point, seat time is critical, and it has that effect. And I think also it had the adverse effect on Oscar Piastri, because there's nothing better being in a great team, being in a great car, and being the only one of the 2 drivers out in FP1, getting all the groundwork done. Admittedly, the McLaren wasn't very good that day, but he was very quick in FP3, and Oscar Piastri P1. And I wonder whether he took that dose of overconfidence perhaps into qualifying. Bear in mind also McLaren, because they were so confident, like Ferrari and Mercedes, ran medium tyres in the first run in Q1. So it was out on mediums and then switching with 3 minutes to go at the end of Q1 effectively onto the soft tyres. And that's where Oscar Piastri made mistakes. and he made mistakes. And it's weird. We're getting kind of sidetracked from the beauty of Carlos Sainz's day, but he made the mistake at turn 12. Interesting how turn 12 again comes into the news, isn't it? Turn 12 in Mexico now, which is the 90-degree right-hander at the end of the back straight that takes you into the stadium. A relatively innocuous corner, a little bit like the last corner in China, actually, that left-hander, except it's a right-hander, of course. And surprising number of errors there. And I suspect it's because the S's before that, leading onto that back straight, are so dramatic. Almost up there in sort of Suzuka territory. If you get them absolutely right, boom, 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 then it's a feeling of, for sure it's a feeling of adrenaline. And you go and you think, right, this is this last really difficult corner, because after that it's all just, wiggle woggle. And I'll brake as late as possible and get the power on as soon as possible. And we saw Yuki Tsunoda go off there in Q2. We saw Nico Hülkenberg lose a lap there, and that's where Oscar Piastri lost his lap. He'd had a track deleted initially on his first run. It wasn't a quick lap anyway, surprisingly enough. It wouldn't have been enough to get him into the top 15, but nonetheless he'd had that. So he was under pressure, and he was out there on the new set of soft tyres, and he just ran over the curb, and it's a very high curb there, and it lifts the car off the ground. You basically lose traction, lose the front, lose the traction, and you just skate along across the curb, and your lap is gone. It's a good curb in that respect, because it does penalise errors. And I should also make the point that I think they did a very good job with track limits in Mexico, turns 2 and 3. Apex, use of apex. We don't see that very often. It's usually running out of road, coming out of a particular corner. But here it's cutting the apex, and they did a really good policing job on that. So full marks to the FIA, Mexico, whoever, who were policing that. Excellent. That's where it caught Charles Leclerc out. It caught Max Verstappen out on his first run in Q3 as well. So a lot of, but I'm getting ahead of myself because there's so much going on. Let's go back to Carlos Sainz, because as I've said before, and I've said in live streams, I've said many times, I can't imagine how difficult this year is for Carlos, and how it will continue to be difficult as well from Ferrari's point of view and from the mechanics' point of view around Carlos's car, working on Carlos's car. They're still giving it 100%, as Carlos is, quite obviously. But he knows he's leaving the team at the end of the year. For what reason? Only because they think there's another driver out there they want who's better, and he can't get involved in that. And of course, Sir Lewis Hamilton is a 7 times world champion, and he's going to bring a lot of other qualities to Ferrari, and that's not up for discussion. What is up for discussion is why they decided they need to do that to replace Carlos Sainz. It was a perfect teammate with Charles Leclerc. You can almost argue now Charles Leclerc's a perfect teammate for Carlos Sainz. I mean, what a lap, what a drive. And he built on that seat time in FP1 from the minute he was out on track in Mexico on Friday morning, knowing that Oliver Behrman was in the other car, and here was an opportunity finally to get a little bit of an edge over Charles. Carlos was just absolutely faultless and super, super quick, and the car was good. Yeah, of course the car is good. It's quickest in a straight line through the trap today. Very good, obviously, through the Sector 1. Sector 2, as we saw with Charles Leclerc losing the back end on his quickest lap in Q3, his last lap in Q3, losing the back end. Carlos absolutely perfect through there as well. And I guess, it's part of it is just the way he drives. He's just softened up those open entries that he has. He's softened up the turn in initially. He's still taking quite wide entries compared with Charles, generally speaking. But he's softened it up. And this started midway through last year, at least, if not a little bit before that. And no mistakes, no adrenaline rushes, going into 12, having got that bit exactly right. And then very good through the last sector. He was actually purple in Sector 3 as well. So think about that. Ferrari quickest in Sector 1, but they were quickest through the trap, 350 kilometers an hour. But also Carlos Sainz quickest in Sector 3, which is very tight corners, slow speed turn in, traction, braking, high speed braking. Very impressive, really impressive. I just can't say any more than that. Just really good. And such a shame he's leaving Ferrari at the end of the year. Such a shame. Because he's the perfect driver for Ferrari. That's it. Anyway, banged on about that enough. Max Verstappen, I thought, was just brilliant throughout the weekend. If you, I've used the yardstick of FP1 and the drivers that had to sit out that session, Lando and Lewis being perfect examples along with Charles Leclerc. But Max Verstappen had a different thing. It was, this car is still not that easy to drive. And look at Sergio Perez in front of his home crowd on a circuit where the car should be half reasonable. He should at least get into Q3. He didn't get out of Q1. Complaining about, and I don't really understand what he's on about, complaining about braking. He couldn't get the car stopped. Too much energy going through the tyres and brakes. And I'm still trying to think about what that actually means. I suppose he means everything's just running too hot and he couldn't get the retardation through the pedal that he needed. Red Bull have done a lot of work, or did a lot of work, going into Mexico on brake cooling. And if that was an issue, you would imagine it would be showing up on Max's car as well. So it's very odd that that's what Perez is pinpointing. And I can't imagine there's something very specific on his car that's different in that area from Max. It reminds me almost of going back to the Australian Grand Prix when Perez was so hopeless under braking there as well. And I said then, I thought looking back post Miami that maybe there was this asymmetric braking valve thing they've taken off the car, and that's why Perez couldn't drive it. Maybe they've got the car pretty much sorted for Max now in terms of being able to turn in on the brakes the way he does. And Perez is kind of lost still on that, in that area, in that one area. It's very strange for him to be that slow compared with Max on a circuit where he should get at least a couple of tenths from the crowd, you would have thought. So, yeah, but anyway, that just shows how this was not an easy car and how Max continued to work head down on that car. Bearing in mind, he didn't really do any running at all in FP2 yesterday due to that power unit change. And he alone, really. I mean, look at who did the long runs this morning in FP3. Max went out very early on on soft tyres, did a time. It wasn't that quick. He ended up about P5, P6. But because he was just desperate to get fuel in the car and go out and do some long runs. And that's what he did. Look at that. The only one, I haven't got Ferrari in there, I haven't got McLaren in there, because they didn't do any long runs. They're all focusing on doing the quick laps. But yet Mercedes did a few. Kevin Magnussen did 3. And look at Max. 22.0, 22.1, 25.3, 21.8, 22.1, 22.3, 22.4. That's a lot of fuel in that car. And that may well come back in spades to help him in the race. That sort of dedication, even though the car's still not very good. And he was saying on the radio, it got no grip at the rear. No grip at the rear. It's all relative, of course, because it doesn't really look that way. You saw the odd little squirm from Max, but he covers it so well that you couldn't really say, watching from the outside, oh, he's got no grip at all. While we're on that, let's just have a look at how the speed trap looked in FP3, because this was a sign of where we were going, I think. And there you see Ferrari 349. Yeah, they were doing 350 in qualifying. The Mercedes was still quick. The Red Bull found a bit of speed in top speed, that's for sure, as did McLaren. McLaren are not far away, a couple of clicks now away from Red Bull, who are almost there with Mercedes. So it's going to be a much tighter top speed battle tomorrow. But it's still an important thing that Max has got the front row of the grid with Lando behind him. That's where he wants Lando, because Max Verstappen, is in the lead of the World Championship by 57 points. Lando's now got the pressure to have to try to get past Max. And of course, Max could make mistakes. Things could happen in the race tomorrow, reliability, etc. But all things being equal, the pressure now is on Lando to get ahead of Max Verstappen. He's got to try and beat him tomorrow. And that run down to the first corner, Red Bull have got a slight top speed advantage over McLaren. Don't forget there's no DRS for the first few laps of the race. And so that's exactly what Max needed to do, and did that time under pressure, as I say, having lost his lap time. So Lando third, Charles Leclerc fourth. Charles lost it, as I say, going through Charles lost the back end going through the S's. Beautiful recovery. I mean, we've had Alex Albon, George Russell, both had big shunts with the back end getting away from them. We've had other big moments. Liam Lawson had a moment there as well yesterday. And Charles held that beautifully and still kept the lap together enough to be P4 because there was pressure on him. But of course that meant that, having had that problem, he was then a little bit cautious going through Sector 3, which is one of the reasons, I guess, that Carlos was so good in terms of looking at the results through Sector 3, because Charles then had to protect the lap and make sure he got the lap, which he did, and he was P4, but he will not be happy at all. And as I say, I think he'll look back and he'll say it privately probably, or maybe he'll say it to Fred, this whole business of sitting out the session at a critical point like this and is not good. And he'll say, well, is it that critical? The championship in the balance, Charles. Yeah, but the last thing he needs is to be blown away by Carlos Sainz. That's his real point, of course. So George Russell 16.3, Lewis 16.7, making that mistake. Getting a reaction from Toto Wolff, like, what is he doing? Didn't look very good on TV. It looked like, what is Lewis doing? I think what Toto was actually thinking was, we had a car that was a little bit quicker than that. I don't think he was actually condemning Lewis for making a mistake. But that's how it came over. And it was a little bit unfortunate, I think. Kevin Magnussen, very good, 16.8. Wow. Almost there with the Mercedes and the Haas Ferrari. Just getting better and better all the time, aren't they? And Nico Hülkenberg, as I say, just is P10 and lost his time out of the dreaded turn 12, getting on the curbs there. Pierre Gasly, outstanding. I've often talked about Pierre, how quick he is, and wouldn't it be nice to see him in a really decent team, decent car? No offence, Ollie Oakes, but you know what I mean. And he did that. He was always there, always quick, all weekend, Pierre Gasly, and just outstandingly good, really, given what he's driving. Alex Albon, a little bit disappointing. He's a little bit quicker than that going into Q3. Q2, very, very good. And so let's also, it's being the knockout qualifying, let's have a look at some of the people who didn't get through. Colapinto, disappointed not to get out of Q1. He had a brake lock-up, just turn 4 it was. A little bit of an error creeping in there. Oscar Piastri, we've talked about. A little bit of overconfidence, I think, in just not overconfidence. He was super confident, let's put it that way, after being so good in FP3 today. And he was already thinking, potential Grand Prix win coming up, I guess. And then a couple of mistakes, just overdriving on the mediums and then on the soft tyre. Again, that weird turn 12 thing of just trying too hard. It's not a corner where you can actually make up a lot of time. It's just one of these corners where you can lose a massive amount of time. I say it's not a corner where you can make a lot of time because everybody brakes late there and there's a moment beyond which you just can't brake, otherwise you're going to have a lock-up. So you just need to find that point. It's like that end of the back straight in Barcelona, a little bit like that. And then after 12, it's not that long a straight. So even if you don't have a great exit and even if you haven't been mega quick through the corner, you're not going to lose that much time. You're still going to be hard on the power going into 13. So, a bit of an error there a huge error from Oscar Piastri and from McLaren's point of view. Calamitous. I say, going back to Lando now, I'm a little bit all over the place because, it's quite late as well. But just the other point is that Lando should have, the minute that happened, that should have lifted Lando, because all of a sudden he didn't have to think about Oscar Piastri anymore, and qualifying for him was about getting in the perfect lap and probably in a car quick enough to beat the Ferraris and the Red Bulls, and he didn't do that. And I'm a bit surprised by that. And I can only say I think that can be traced back also to Friday morning and not running in FP1. And I still think McLaren should have made Piastri sit out FP1. I know that they were taking it in turns and it was his turn, all that stuff, but I think they should have said, right, given the state of everything, that's what we should have done. That's what I would have done anyway. And who else didn't get out of Ocon? Zoe didn't get out of Q1, Q2. Yuki Tsunoda had that shunt. He would have been about 7th. He was on a good lap, and he was a classic example. The adrenaline was up. He'd got the S's right. He was going to be quick, and he just braked too late and ran off and hit the wall, and that effectively ended at any chance Liam Lawson, his teammate, had of getting into Q3, because they were absolutely, in terms of lap time, the first runs, they'd been within a tenth of one another. So they were right there, and Liam was behind him and hadn't started his lap really, but he would have got through for sure. Aston Martin, absolutely pathetic really, weren't they, given how much money they've got and how much all there is, all the people they've got and everything else. I mean, Fernando out-qualified Lance Stroll in his 400th Grand Prix start, but I think it's his 400th. I will wait to have Alice Norsky confirm that with our proper stats tomorrow. Lance Stroll and Fernando very close to one another, just nowhere really. They were never going to get into Q3. And Valtteri Bottas, who did a good job actually in a car that's still very slow, and it looked like he was always sort of first out of the pits and the first guy doing a quick time. Didn't make it through to Q3, but good job to get into Q2. So there we are. Carlos Sainz on the pole. in a car absolutely capable of winning the Grand Prix. And all things being, I mean, he's made no mistakes as far as I can see. And Carlos will be... Oh, there was one moment actually when in FP3 this morning when Oscar Piastri said, oh, you know, that's typical of Carlos or something like that. And what had happened was Carlos was going slowly, having done a quick lap. He was going slowly through the S's, Oliver Berman-like, but he was on the left side of the road on this occasion. And you could see what happened. He looked in his mirrors and sees Piastri coming quickly and absolutely does the right thing and moves off track just to give Piastri enough room. Moves right off track and just pulls back in front. And what happened was Piastri, the minute he saw Carlos go off track, he was distracted. There was dust or something, I suppose, and lifted. And so when Carlos rejoined, he was very near Piastri. But the reality was Carlos did exactly the right thing and he got out of the way, and he just assumed Piastri was going to keep going and rejoined, and he was amazed that Piastri had backed off. I think that's what happened. That's what it looked like. And Piastri gets on the radio saying, oh, typical Carlos. I would have said, wow, you know, that was brilliant reactions from Carlos to get out of the way he did, just to make sure he was completely off track and not blocking Piastri at all. And it just never occurred to him that Piastri was going to come out of the throttle. I think that was the point there. So that was the only real incident involving Carlos Sainz that I could see, and he's just had this absolutely peerless weekend so far. The gravitational forces are behind him, with Charles Leclerc sitting out FP1 and just looking great in the car. And I hope it's an embarrassing thing for Ferrari, from everybody on the pit wall, that they are firing this guy. I mean, it is so ridiculous. And yeah, it's very easy to quote people who are saying what I'm saying out of context and say, oh, you think that Carlos Sainz is a better driver than Lewis Hamilton. I've never said that in a million years. I've always said, from Lewis's point of view, this is absolutely the right decision, and he's going to go really well at Ferrari. He's going to enjoy the last few years of his career, and it's well earned from his point of view. Yeah, why would he not take it? That is not the point. The point is why they even thought about this in the first place, because they've got this perfect team, and there they are. Of course, you know, Lewis will do a good job, no doubt about that. But Carlos Sainz has done a brilliant job as well, and is still doing a brilliant job. And I think it's a similar thing to the situation at McLaren, which I criticised a long time ago, which was if you've got Daniel Ricciardo in the other car alongside Lando Norris, you don't need Oscar Piastri. Or conversely, if you've got Oscar Piastri, you don't need Lando Norris. You know, they're both super quick, and they're going to end up, as they have done already, massively taking points from one another. And if you look at what McLaren would be like now and how many points Lando would have now, if Daniel Ricciardo was still at McLaren, I think it may not be the 34 points that I've mentioned in my video, but it would be in the region of 25 points for sure if Daniel was still at McLaren, and they'd still be in great shape in the Constructors' Championship. But Lando's points gap to Max would be much less. That's the point. But yeah, you know, but Oscar's a faster driver. We've got to have him, and it's a bit like, you know, Lewis Hamilton, got to have him. Just, you know, sometimes you have to look at what you've got and don't replace something because you want it. You only replace it if you need to. There's two different things there. It's like people who have 27 different watches. You know, they all work perfectly. Don't actually need 27 watches to tell the time, if you see what I mean. Anyway, there we go. Bit of philosophy at the end of this long night here. It's going to be a good race. It's going to be an amazing drag down to the first corner, I think. Those red cars. Lando wondering what to do about Max. Oh, there's a gap. Shall we go? Oh, yeah, track limits, apex, whatever. Max thinking, yeah, I'll just brake here whenever I want, slow everybody down. Carlos is off my left. I might go down and take the lead. You know, anything could happen at that first corner. It's a long drag. It's very spectacular. So do not miss it. The Mexican Grand Prix, lap 1, turn 1. Big thanks to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive, and to Track Ninja, and of course to you, the viewer, for watching. Can't wait for tomorrow. See you then. An absolutely stunning win for Carlos Sainz in the Mexican Grand Prix. The Ferrari driver on the pole, didn't lead from the start, had to fight very hard in the early laps, but once he got free air in front of him, just superb. And there were some lovely little radio transmissions as well, where he was saying, I think we're going hard enough. We don't need the pressure from behind. In other words, tell Charles Leclerc to back away, please. And other little things like that, where Carlos was just emphasizing his position in the team as the dominant driver this weekend. All this to the backdrop of the reality that he's going to be sacked by Ferrari at the end of the year. And I use that word sacked because it's absolutely right. He politely says, I'm leaving Ferrari at the end of the year. Of course, he has to say that. But Ferrari is sacking him, basically. And it is just incredible to me that a driver of this quality, who fits in so well with the team, who's so harmonious with the mechanics and the way things work at Ferrari, is being dropped. Anyway, I know why he's being dropped. We won't go any further down there, but what a win for Carlos Sainz. Great to see his dad there as well. Just what a day for the Sainz family. Just superb. Lots of pressure too. Lots of pressure early on at the start. As I said, from the pole, it's never an easy run down into that first corner, turn 1 in Mexico. It's a long run, and slipstreams certainly come into play. There's no DRS, of course. And it was Max Verstappen, kind of as predicted, who was on the front row, who managed to get the inside run into turn 1 on that first lap. And Carlos stayed with it on the outside out of 1, rejoined in front of Max, and then did exactly the right thing. He dropped back and gave the position to Max. I wonder at this point what the guys on the McLaren pit wall were thinking. Yeah, this is what we should have done in Austin. Too late for that, of course, but perfect judgment by Carlos Sainz. Didn't need any instructions from the pit wall about that one. It was just give the position back. I can beat this guy on the track. And that's exactly what he did. Beautiful pass 2 or 3 laps later after the safety car had come in. Yuki Tsunoda went off before the first corner, under braking for the first corner really, in a crash with Alex Albon in the big car, but had just been rebuilt overnight after his shunt in Q2 in qualifying yesterday. Probably even more damage to this one. He hit the wall quite hard with the rear. Anyway, safety car came out, and Carlos was just superb after that. Took the lead and walked away with it, really. There was pressure right at the end when Lando Norris eventually got past Charles Leclerc, and he was up to P2. And the gap then was about 6 to 7 seconds, and it was pretty clear that Lando's car at that point, even compared with Carlos's Ferrari, had more grip, more balance, and was looking after its tyres a little bit better. Everybody on the hard tyre at that point. It was a one-stop strategy race. Started on the medium, went to the hard. But Carlos just stayed absolutely cool as you could possibly be and crossed the line to win, doing one of those wonderful swerves down towards the pit wall, spraying everybody with debris. He would have loved that as well. The Ferrari bit particularly, I think. This wasn't Mark Webber saying not bad for the wrong side of the garage, or I think for the other side of the garage, as he said after the British Grand Prix memorably that year when he beat Sebastian Vettel. But this was Carlos saying, well, you're going to drop me, but here's some stuff for your red shirts. I know they have protective stuff these days, but nonetheless, the gesture was there. Wonderful to see. And yeah, I just thought Carlos was superb. And against that, Charles Leclerc had a tough race, and he should really have been second. He took second place, actually, when Max and Lando were doing their thing, and sneaked inside, got away, and at that point, he was going to start to put pressure on Carlos, but he was called in first to cover Lando Norris, who'd come in obviously a little bit earlier to try to get the undercut, which gave a bit of an advantage to Carlos. And then Carlos actually disobeyed team orders and stayed out 1 lap extra, as he would, George Russell style, just to get 1 more lap out of the medium so he'd have fresher hards. And it paid off beautifully. He drove so well, and he planned the race so well, and he thought about the race so well. And Charles early on had engine rising temperatures, as you would in traffic. Very, very tough on cooling here. Ferrari, like everybody, had extra louvers for cooling. But if you're stuck in traffic, as Charles was, I say stuck in traffic, traffic in front was going the same speed. It's not as if he could do anything about it. And the temperatures were going up, and the tyres, therefore, also went off in the debris from, not the debris, but in the turbulence of the Sainz Ferrari. And that's where Carlos started to eke away and drove a race right up there with the very best of a Lewis Hamilton win or a Max Verstappen win or a Charles Leclerc win, you got to say. I mean, this was just a class performance. For sure the best race weekend and race win he's ever had, I would say. I would say it's the best one ever for Carlos. And just wonderful to see. So Charles should have been second really, but his tyres went off really badly towards the end of the race, partly because he'd been in the slipstream with Carlos, and Lando was all over him in the closing stages, and forced Charles into a big error coming out of. We don't often see big errors coming out of the Perrotella these days because it's a much slower corner. It's got a tight early apex, and then it just sort of opens out. And he just lost it on acceleration, a bit like you can lose it, I guess, coming out of the chicane at Suzuka just before the start-finish line. Very odd to see that, but the back end obviously got away from him, and he had to use a lot of road and a lot of extra road as well on the outside. And Lando didn't even have to use DRS at that point to get past, just breezed past and took second place. But the interesting thing was that then meant that Charles could now, had such a big gap over the two Mercedes. He had such a big gap. He could come in and put on a set of soft tyres and set fastest lap. Whereas if Lando had been in third place, he presumably would have done that. So the fastest lap went to Charles, which is good for Ferrari. Not so good for McLaren and Lando, but only talking about 1 point though, of course. And I suppose from Ferrari's point of view, it mitigated a little bit the loss of second place. And what would they be thinking? You know, our number one driver, the guy we're keeping and who's going to be out there with Lewis Hamilton next year, is beaten by Lando Norris, and we're saved by Carlos Sainz. Wow, what an internal dynamic that is. And Carlos is such a humble person and such a good person that he won't rub their noses in it. No way. Of course, adulation is the wrong word. Adulation in Mexico for Carlos, but the euphoria of winning that Mexican Grand Prix the way he did will totally counterbalance any feeling of "I told you, you're doing the wrong thing" or whatever he might be thinking. And so, yeah, the plot thickens. I say it thickens because Perez had another terrible race, which began by stopping short or long, obviously, on his grid slot. The last driver I can remember doing that was Pierre Gasly, I think, in a Spanish Grand Prix a couple of years ago. And now Perez has done that. I mean, that is inexcusable, really. I mean, there's a million things that can go wrong in a Grand Prix. There's a million things that you don't get right on a Grand Prix car throughout the Grand Prix distance. But the few things that are in your control, like starting in the right grid slot, you know, no excuse for not doing those. And he didn't. He got a penalty for that, and then he had to make a second pit stop. He's in traffic, and he wasn't happy with the car anyway. Anyway, I say all that in the context of when I mentioned the plot thickens, because Red Bull must be thinking. I can't imagine that they wouldn't be thinking of, we've got to try and put Carlos Sainz in that car for next year. I'd be absolutely shocked if they're not thinking that. And if they're not, they should be. Because he should be in that car alongside Max Verstappen. He's the perfect driver for Red Bull. And we've got Franco Colapinto standing on the sidelines next year that Williams love, and he's doing a good job, drove well again in Mexico. And he should be in the Williams next year. And Carlos Sainz, thank you very much, has put him in the Red Bull, and Checo should be waving to the crowd into the sunset. I just, you know, and I think after this weekend, there's even more chance that might happen. But anyway, we'll have to wait and see. Of course, they might put Colapinto in a Red Bull, but I mean, it'd be much more logical to put Carlos Sainz in there for sure. Anyway, it's interesting if you look at those three results and how quick Lando was once he'd got through all the early lap skirmishes with Max Verstappen, and once he'd realised that his race, when he put the radio up, once he got onto his hard tyres and he got on the radio and said, "What sort of lap times is Charles doing?" And they said, I think at the time he was doing something like 20.8 or 20.7 or something like that. And immediately Lando starts doing 20.3s, 20.2s, and you know there's going to be a race on. And so it proved. And he just drove superbly. I think it gives rise to the question of, where was he in qualifying? Why did he only qualify third? Which is what I did say yesterday. I mean, it was a bit of a surprising result for me that he didn't. And I put it down to not having enough seat time and McLaren's odd decision. I say it's odd because I know they had their reasons, but their odd decision to stand him down in FP1, this guy who's potentially right in the running for the Drivers' World Championship. They didn't have him out in the car in FP1 yesterday. And I think that catches up. And I think Charles Leclerc kind of confirmed that after the race when he said he was on the back foot from yesterday onwards. Translation, I wasn't in the car either. And if you look at those results, Carlos Sainz was, and he was like a bullet from the minute FP1 began on Friday, totally in sync with the car and the team. Whereas Charles had to get in a car that had just been kind of rebuilt after that shunt that Behrman had. And then Lando had to get in the car from Pato O'Ward. And I think that just did put them on the back foot. And I think what you see there is a result of what happened in FP1, to be honest, under the heading of Carlos Sainz absolutely maximised the opportunity he was given. Fourth and fifth were the two Mercedes, way off the pace, early, and a lot of racing between the two of them. a massive amount of racing. George was behind Lewis and then eventually got Lewis. And then later on, just after his pit stop, something broke on the front wing. It looked like they said there was something asymmetric on the front wing, and he started to lose a bit of the balance and the feel of the car. And Lewis was all over him, but couldn't get past. And George was just absolutely using every bit of road. I don't know how long it went on, for 20 laps or something like that. And again, I wonder, as I said many times, I think Mercedes are very fortunate they actually don't have a race-winning, championship-winning car, because you can imagine the fireworks that he would have had over the last 2 or 3 years between George and Lewis. As it was, they're only racing for 4th or 5th place, so it didn't really matter at all. And afterwards, Lewis said there was something wrong with the floor as well, I think, on his car. Yeah, neither car was good and neither car was particularly competitive. But that's what you get if you have the 2 best drivers you can possibly have. If it was Bottas Hamilton, it would have been a different race for Mercedes. And if it was Ricciardo Lando would have more points now, as I've pointed out endlessly in separate videos and so forth. But there's this thing for having the 2 best guys you can get, and it does penalise you sometimes. And then Max Verstappen finished 6th, a very distant 6th, with 2 10-second penalties. And when various other drivers heard Verstappen's got a 20-second penalty, they'll think, wow, 20 seconds. Of course, 2 10s, not quite as bad as 120, I suppose. And so the verdict on those, I think the first one, which was a Lando thing, is a little bit like going into the second chicane at Monza when Piastri went round the outside of Lando. Lando was doing that to Max, and whereas Lando at Monza just moved the steering to the left and gave Piastri room, but as a result had a bit of a moment and Leclerc got him. Here, obviously, Max was never going to do that in a million years, and he didn't actually go off track anything. Max just used all the road, and in my book, if you're on the inside, you're entitled to use all the road. If the guy wants to try and pass you on the outside, so be it. But of course, that isn't the rule book, and I think from Max's point of view, it was not very good judgment, really, because it was pretty clear after everything had happened in Austin and the way Lando went off track, it was pretty clear that the logical thing would have been then to have dropped back and given Lando that position. But he didn't. And then I think he made a big mistake because he went into the S's, turn 7, the first left, where you never pass. And Lando was sort of middle of the road and went boom down the inside. For all those that think that it was entirely Lewis Hamilton's fault at Copse Corner, Silverstone 21, take note here. Here's Lando going down the inside in the way Lewis did into Copse. Left-hander rather than right-hander, but similar move, similar speed as well, going into that left-hander. And immediately ran wide, and Lando had to run wide to avoid him there, and he got another penalty for that. Now that one I think was totally justified because A, it was not really a place to overtake, and B, I don't think Max would have done that if there were a line of trees there, or a guardrail, or a rock wall. I think he did it because there's all that runoff area. And that's not right. You know, if you're making decisions about track craft and what you're doing when you're racing another car, you don't base a move on, oh, well, if something goes wrong, I can go off into the runoff area. If you do, you should get penalised, in my view. And I think that's exactly what happened there. And they correctly gave him a penalty for that. I'm not sure about the first one because you know my view. I think if you're on the inside, really, you know, you try and pass at your peril on the outside. But I know that's not the rule. I know that's the rule book is that you got to give room to the guy on the outside. So, and I think also in the context of sort of anticipating what the stewards might do here to Max if he did anything slightly out of the ordinary after what happened in Austin. I think, you know, if you're Red Bull, you would say, Max, just calm it, because for sure they'll be right on top of you. And I'm surprised that they didn't. It was sort of an aggressive thing, and Max was aggressive. And I think he was also quite wound up because he'd got some sort of battery charging issue going on. Not the first time we've seen that at Red Bull either this year. I have been saying all the time, you know, we talk about pace of the cars and how it's going to go over the next, 4 races now. And people talk about, you know, Lando here, maybe the Red Bull will be good there. I've often said reliability is also a factor. You know, you cannot assume that the Red Bull is going to be as reliable as the McLaren Mercedes, because it hasn't been. And here we had another issue. This was some sort of battery charging issue. It seemed to resolve itself, and Max was pretty quick in a straight, well, he was very quick in a straight line after about 15 laps. But early on, he was on the radio saying, how am I supposed to drive this thing if I haven't got any charging going on? And I think he was a bit of a red mist going on there. And it was just like, well, if they can't give me the power, I will save the day behind the wheel with what I do with the steering. And I think that was a little bit of what we saw in Max today, which you could say, I think half the people out there will say, well, that's why he's, never going to be as good as Michael or whatever you want to say. And that's why some people say, well, that's why he's such a racing driver. It depends how you want to look at that one. He's got a pretty simplistic approach to racing life, Max Verstappen, which is, there's a gap, I'm going for it. Couldn't be more simple than that. Kevin Magnussen drove really well. Totally uneventful race by Kevin's standards to finish P7 for Haas Ferrari. What a result. Nico Hülkenberg P9. Both cars in the points yet again. What a season they're having. And Oscar Piastri, after his mistake yesterday, drove pretty well and showed how quick that McLaren was, up to P8 to finish in the points too. And Pierre Gasly got a point, qualified really well. He was up there and he held his position, and he still, he beat the likes of Lance Stroll in the Aston Martin and the Williams guys, and Liam Lawson, who had we had a front wing skirmish thing with, I think it was Franco Colapinto, as he would, aggressive driver. So, yeah, it was always going to be a dramatic race. It was always going to be dramatic in those early laps as well, because that long straight, that tight turn 1, turn 2 combination, and then lots of opportunities to overtake with DRS. But at the end of the day, my feeling is that McLaren had the faster car this weekend, the McLaren Mercedes. I think it was a better car over the lap, and also in terms of looking after its tyres. And had Lando qualified on the front row, I'm not saying on the pole because it doesn't necessarily mean much in Mexico, but had he qualified on the front row and had he got the lead at the start, two big ifs, I know, but as I say, I think it was the best car. I think he would have walked that race. He wouldn't have walked it, but I think he would have led it profoundly from start to finish. And I think Carlos would have been second. But because that didn't happen in qualifying, he didn't get quite enough out of the car in the closing phase of Q3. The win went to Ferrari. And of the two Ferrari drivers, it was Carlos Sainz, the guy who was there in FP1, who just did the most magical job. I can only imagine what it's like now back in Madrid at the house of the Sainz family and how they're feeling. It's just like, okay, that's what Ferrari do. Who cares? He's going to be in a Williams next year. Yeah, we know. He's won the Mexican Grand Prix. He's beaten Charles like that, and he's done it. You don't have to do a lot more now. Of course, it'd be great to win a world championship from Carlos's point of view. I suppose the only other thing is, let's wait for the phone to ring from Christian Horner or Helmut Marko to see if there's a deal to be done there. If I was Carlos, I'd be pushing for that. But knowing Carlos, he's a gentleman, and he probably will wait for the phone to ring. But what a guy. What a great result for him. Congratulations to him and to Ferrari and to Freddie Vasseur for doing that. And for the mixed feelings they must have. And what sort of farewell are they going to have for Carlos at Ferrari when he walks out of the door the last time? How are they going to do that? Yeah, interesting to know. Anyway, big thanks to OEM Exclusive, to Jetcraft, and to Track Ninja. Thanks for your support, and thank you to the viewer for your support as well. As you can see, I'm not in my normal studio. Hope this has turned out okay. The audio is good and everything else. I'll check it now. See you soon.